Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. It's a great pleasure for Policy Exchange to be able to team up with Create Streets for this most important of topics around placemaking, new national design criteria, and we're delighted to be able to welcome the biggest beast in the firmament in this area, namely new Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Robert Jenrick, who's been a good friend to us through the years. He'll be taking us through the new national design criteria and other areas around the newly significant area, as it's now called, of placemaking, particularly significant area because in the era of growing polarization and division politically, the question of placemaking seems an improbable area around the construction of a new national consensus, which is part of our own responsibility and work here at Policy Exchange. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. We've had events on socialism and beauty, on the importance of placemaking in areas which are held by all political parties, and this new sort of emerging dialogue across the divide is something which I think will certainly be reflected upon in questions and in other discussions today. It's a particular pleasure to be able to do this because Policy Exchange and Create Streets have together played a part in placing the issue on the map with the original publication of the paper Create Streets, co-published in 2013, and then subsequently under the work of Jack Airy, our outstanding head of housing here, with the polling that's been done showing the enormous support for the importance of design and style in popular opinion in the country, in the polling that we've done, in the focus groups we've done, and that this is the true basis in a democracy for ensuring that there is consent for more house building to resolve the housing crisis in a fashion that is acceptable to communities and preserves the integrity and the appearance of places in a way that is acceptable to its residents, who, as several here have already said today, are at the heart of any such process of placemaking and house building. So with great pleasure, I call upon Secretary of State, Honourable Robert Jenrick MP. He'll be talking for 20 minutes and then opening it up to questions. Usual House rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. Robert, thank you for coming. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. When I walk into my office at the Ministry of Housing, as we now call it each morning, there is a wall of portraits of some of the great reforming ministers who've held my office in the post-war era, from Harold Macmillan, Sir Keith Joseph to Michael Heseltine. And I think that some of them have set out to build more homes, some to reform our undoubtedly complex and convoluted housing and planning system, and some have used this office to breathe new life into communities, whether that's London's Docklands or inner city Liverpool. And I take inspiration in different ways from each of them and many of their different achievements. And if I'm given time to do so, which is not a given in this job, as there do seem to be quite a lot of housing secretaries, I'll seek to carry forward in different ways the torches that they've brought forward themselves. Another of my predecessors, John Prescott, in a classic of the genre that he created of inadvertent phrases, he said when he was addressing the Labour Party's conference as Housing Secretary that the Green Belt was a great post-war achievement and I intend to build on it. Well, that isn't one of my priorities. Number 10 will be pleased to hear if they're listening to this speech. But I do want to build upon the great things that some of my predecessors have achieved when they've really tried to reform the housing market. But today I want to make an argument that I would suggest hasn't exercised the considerable talents and imagination of my predecessors nearly as much as one might have wished. Not how many homes, not where do we build the homes, or even for whom are we building homes, although it's not unrelated to those very important questions. But what do those houses actually look like? How do they relate to each other? How are those houses homes? And how do we collectively create places where people can actually build good lives? And I'd like to thank Policy Exchange and Create Streets for giving me the platform to do so today. Policy Exchange under Dean's formidable leadership and Create Streets under Nicholas Boyd-Smith's, I think, very precipitant guidance, has developed an argument which you are now very familiar with, to coin a phrase, for a kinder and gentler, a more humane, a more beautiful architecture, and above all, an argument that appears to be winning. It's an argument which appears to be turning the tide on the post-war vision of housing. Now, when I was first appointed just a few months ago, I was sent a letter by the Prime Minister congratulating me, and he pointed out a phrase in Kenneth Clarke, not the MP for Rushcliffe, won't be surprised to hear, but the author of that seminal series from my childhood, Civilization, a phrase that he said that if I had to say which was telling the truth about society, a speech by a minister of housing or the actual buildings that are put up in his time, I would believe the buildings. And I think that was a challenge to me, not just to make fine speeches, but actually to be judged on the types of buildings that are built whilst we're lucky enough to be in office. And that's the challenge that I'm going to take up today. Earlier this month, I was at the REBA Awards to help announce the winners of the Sterling Prize for the building that has made the greatest contribution to the evolution of architecture in the past year. As I'm sure some of you will know who follow these things, the winner was Goldsmith Street in Norwich, and that became the first ever social housing scheme to win the Sterling Prize. And these are very beautifully designed homes, and they meet the Passive House standard for energy efficiency with state-of-the-art insulation, triple glazed windows, and high-tech fans blowing fresh air in and stale air out. They come with high ceilings, spacious bedrooms, fibre optic broadband, garden lawns, parking, communal greens with flowers, plants, benches, and safe play areas for children. It really is a superb development that's worthy of the award. But I was struck by how what was actually being celebrated was remarkably simple. It was even ordinary. There was a moment where the architect who presented the award said, "Isn't it wonderful that these houses have front doors?" They were terraced houses with doors on streets lined with trees. Things which most people in this country will consider to be pretty straightforward, ordinary features that have existed for hundreds of years. And it made me realise that over the last few decades, many developers, many architects, and yes, most governments have suffered what can only be described as collective amnesia. We've forgotten what it means to build beautiful homes and to create beautiful places. We've forgotten the basics, that building attractive homes which people can actually take pride in and care for, the sorts of homes where people want to raise their children, to grow old together, can be good neighbours, places which are designed with communities where people can live and pay respect to the identity and heritage of their area. So Goldsmith Street is not just living proof that buildings can be attractive and environmentally friendly, important those objectives are, and which I'll return to in a moment. It is, I think, a reconnection with common sense. Now, the research that my department has been doing shows very vividly what you heard from Dean in his brief introduction. That, unsurprisingly, people care about quality. They care about beauty. They care about a sense of place. Almost 70% of people who believe new homes are well built are more likely to support development in their local area. And unsurprisingly, it's the same story when we talk about the design of places. The research suggests that the vast majority of people now feel that new build houses must be well designed. And if they are, they're far more likely to support new homes being built in their neighbourhood than those who feel that their new homes are likely to be ugly or not in keeping with their local environment. So if we want to meet the challenge of the housing crisis, we have to ensure that the new homes we build are beautiful, good quality, safe, and part of real functioning communities. So what are we actually going to do? How are we going to take up the mantle that has been provided to us by Create Streets and Policy Exchange and many others, some of which are represented in this room? Well, I think it's now time that government played its part. And we're going to begin this process by creating the first National Design Code. We've already made some important steps in this regard. As you know, we've revised the National Planning Policy Framework to make clear that creating high-quality buildings and places must be at the heart of the process. The framework expands on the fundamental principles of good design to define what is expected of local authorities and developers to support the creation of beautiful places. It also provides guidance for local authorities to explain how planning policies and decisions could facilitate this. My predecessor, James Brokenshire, appointed the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission under Nicholas's leadership, along with the great Sir Roger Scruton, to advise the government on how best to promote and increase the use of high-quality design for new build homes and neighbourhoods. Their interim report, published in July this year, has set out over 30 propositions, including ones to encourage greater community involvement in shaping new homes, creating the kinds of places in which people genuinely want to live. They'll be reporting back later this year, and I'm confident that we will be taking forward their recommendations. But I think we can go significantly further than that, and that's where I hope my new National Design Guide will come in. We're going to be using this to set out a very clear model for the first time for promoting good quality design and the style of homes and neighbourhoods that people actually want to see across the country, not set by edict in Whitehall, but shaped by local people. Now, I want these local design guides, which every local authority will be asked to create, to actually become the product of listening to local people and groups, considering local traditions, and embedding in these codes, and then in turn embedding that in the planning system, and creating a legal right for local people to demand these standards. And I think these codes will turn out to be quite simple. They'll set, for example, a presumption in favour of homes on streets, homes with front doors, homes with fronts and backs, quality facades, roofs in line with local traditions, concern for local vernacular and heritage, and a presumption for the first time in favour of tree-lined streets. In the last month, we've launched our National Design Guide, and this introduces the national gold standard to which local authorities should adhere and use as an essential reference when designing their own tailored guides in due course. The National Design Guide illustrates how well-designed places are beautiful, enduring and successful, and how these can be achieved in practice. I think there's a great deal more that we can go beyond this. And I think we only have to look to some of the great visionaries of the past, people who created beautiful towns and cities in the not-too-distant past, people like Ebenezer Howard and Henrietta Barnett, who created places that people now love and cherish, and we want to build upon this. I want to see today's developers, architects and designers striving to be the Howards and Barnetts of our time, to create green neighbourhoods of the future with well-being, belonging and community cohesion at their heart, and leaving a green legacy that future generations will thank us for. So we have to set our sights high. And so alongside good quality design and placemaking, we also have to ensure that these new developments are actually gold standards for sustainable, environmentally friendly homes, which, like our garden cities of the past, will actually stand the test of time. So in this regard, we are paving the way for our future home standard that I was able to announce just a few weeks ago. The consultation we're running here, which will last until the beginning of next year, will create stronger building regulations to ensure that every new home that's built in this country from 2025 will have low or zero carbon emissions and the highest levels of energy efficiency. And we're clear that developers will now need to do their bit in tackling the threat of climate change, embracing new technologies such as air source heat pumps and the latest generation of solar panels. It's through these reforms that we can create the future-proofed homes that we think people really need. But it's only by taking a longer-term view that we can begin to re-establish the integral link between people and places, between community and identity. Whatever one's view of the referendum, no one can deny that the country's decision to leave the European Union has also brought to the fore many of the underlying social and economic divisions that we always knew existed, but which successive governments have failed to properly address. And it's those divisions which, to some extent, have been borne out by people feeling disillusioned and disconnected from the decision-making that affects their day-to-day lives. Now, none of these problems can be solved overnight. Our increasingly polarized society won't be brought together in an instant. But there are real practical steps that we can take to put local people at the forefront of decision-making and to give them a greater say in how their neighborhoods develop, so that it reflects the true identity of their communities. More people than ever before now have a direct placemaking role in their local area, with over 2,600 different groups having started the neighbourhood planning process since 2012. And that means millions of people taking ownership of their neighbourhoods, defining what is important to them, and making sure that actually happens. And as Secretary of State, I intend to take that forward, putting plan making at the heart of our planning system and ensuring that those plans have quality of design, have a sense of community, and have the environment at their absolute heart. This also brings me on to another area that I want to take forward as Secretary of State. This shows what we can achieve when we put power directly into people's hands. But it also, I think, shows that to create real places, they have to have a sense of identity, and that means protecting their past. I want to encourage local communities and heritage groups to get far more involved in identifying the historic buildings in their area so they can be at the heart of the process of recognizing, of defining and protecting buildings that they truly value. Because we know that where buildings are on local or national heritage lists, they are often shielded from development, and that again builds consent for development and build better communities. Now, until now, this has mostly been the domain of our local planning authorities. But only 50% of planning authorities even have these lists. And where they do, they're often out of date or incomplete. This isn't good enough. Protecting the historic environment must be a key function of the planning system. All local planning authorities must play a far more proactive role in supporting local communities and heritage groups to identify and to protect more historic buildings. In the 1980s, Michael Heseltine reinvigorated our national heritage lists, and now I want to complete that work and to do the same at the local level. So as a first step, I'm announcing what I think will be the most ambitious heritage preservation campaign since Michael's work 40 years ago. We'll start with 10 English counties and support them to complete their local lists and to bring forward more suggestions for the national statutory lists as well. It will see local people coming forward to nominate the buildings and community assets they cherish, protecting them for future generations. And we're backing this programme with £500,000 of government investment, giving those counties the tools, the funding, the expertise they need to shift their approach to heritage and conservation up a gear. And to help us do this, we're going to appoint a National Heritage Advisor to support this vital work and to make sure that government is actually delivering. And I want to thank Marcus Binney and Simon Jenkins and the SAVE team for their input and inspiration for this initiative. We hope that this will help us to boost conservation efforts in counties, enabling fresh engagement with local communities and our heritage groups. But our work doesn't stop there. We're also working with the Department for Culture and with Historic England on developing an entirely new heritage conservation programme. We're going to be supporting Historic England to develop a new process to enable faster community nominations of important heritage assets in the new heritage action zones. And this builds on the £95 million of government funding that was announced earlier this year to unlock the economic potential of 69 historic high streets. We're determined to ensure that these places can once again be refreshed and renewed and given new life. And at the heart of this will be local people as well as a new team of heritage activists, what we want to call the modern day monuments men and women, who will be working across England to find these buildings and get them listed locally or nationally as soon as possible. Now, our new heritage preservation campaign also supports, I think, the wider shift that we're seeing in society that focuses on sustainability and how we can protect communities and our planet. Today, there is more recognition than ever before that we must be building to last. Research shows that the construction, demolition and excavation of old homes generates around 3/5 of total UK non-hazardous waste every year, which is a staggering figure. For the country to cut its carbon footprint, drive sustainability and meet our new net zero target, all of us in industry and in government have a responsibility to promote the reuse of existing buildings. The ill-fated programme of demolition and destruction pursued by governments of the past resulted in thousands of well-built pre-1919 terraced houses, for example, being needlessly destroyed. In great cities like Liverpool, the housing market renewal initiative resulted in property prices sharply increasing, while putting important historic buildings like the birthplace of Ringo Starr under threat. Today, developers are rediscovering the value in the renovation and refurbishment of Victorian terraces like the Welsh streets of Liverpool, streets that were once under serious and needless threat of being knocked down. These are now in a new wave of regeneration and renewal. We also need to be ambitious and creative and imaginative in repurposing commercial and public buildings. I think of examples like the redevelopment of HMS Daedalus site in Lee on the Solent. After the Second World War, this naval site included several beautiful Victorian buildings. It was used as a technical training facility for the Royal Navy before falling into disrepair. Demolition seemed the only viable option until developers came forward with proposals to uncover the base's rich history, converting derelict buildings into new homes and apartments with all of the car parking and landscaping that it needs. I hope examples like this will be taken forward by developers across the country, bringing historic buildings back into life and making them useful for communities. And I will certainly be supporting initiatives like that through the planning system and through my powers as Secretary of State, bringing new purpose to brownfield land to historic buildings and helping us to get people living back in empty homes. I think these examples show us that we can reconcile two ostensibly opposing challenges: how we can design beautiful and eye-catching homes whilst also building at scale, at pace, and at low cost. Critics would have us believe that these challenges cannot be solved simultaneously. I think that cynicism is wrong and unfounded. What we've seen in some of the country's largest and most successful recent developments, from Northstowe in Cambridgeshire to the Stonebridge homes of Yorkshire to the wonderful redevelopment around King's Cross, is that design which speaks to an area's heritage, its history, its identity, is universally popular. In fact, it's only beautiful design in keeping with an area's existing aesthetic, sensitive to local concerns, which unlocks public consent for new development, which saves costly delays from legal challenges and frees up developers to get on and build the homes we need. For too long, there's been a misconception that the house building industry has had, that quality needs to be the enemy of supply. In fact, experience shows us that it is those developments of the highest quality and the most attractive design which are approved faster, which sell faster, and which are the most enduringly popular. The exciting technological innovation currently taking place across the sector through modern methods of construction makes this even easier than before for architects, for designers and builders to integrate beauty into their plans without compromising on delivery. The great package of measures that the government has introduced over the last 10 years to simplify the planning process, to bring forward brownfield land for regeneration, to set the house building industry free, which I believe has to be just the first steps, has resulted in a significant increase in homes being built. However, we know that we need to go further. This year looks likely to be the year in which we build more homes than any year bar one in my adult lifetime, but we must go much further and faster. It means that even our target of building 300,000 homes a year by the mid-2020s may not be ambitious enough. To do this, we have to embrace technology, the technology being brought forward with the digital age to make homes built further, make homes built faster. But I think we also have to renew our enthusiasm for transforming quality design in the supply of homes so we can build a greener and a better Britain. That's the challenge that I will be taking forward as Secretary of State, working with Policy Exchange, working with Create Streets, to build a Britain that is genuinely built to last, to create a society that has re-established powerful links between identity and place, between history and the future, between community and purpose. This, I hope, is a country that rediscovers the truth, first espoused by John Ruskin, when he said that we must build, and when we do, let us think that we build forever. For me, that will be the guiding principle as we set out the future of the planning system. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that prompt many questions. Who do I see as first takers? Just going to get a feel of how many in the room. Gentleman there and toward the front, yeah.
Robbie Carr.
If we wait for the microphone so people can name an organisation, please.
Robbie Carr, Adam Architecture, one of the directors there. I'm very interested by your design codes. We've been working with your colleagues, I think, behind the scenes on that, and support many of the points you bring. I think would be interesting to find out is your thoughts on how that then gets implemented through the process, because a design code is great for giving greater clarity, but actually it's seeing that coming through the whole way through the legacy of the project, where the real quality will actually be realised.
Well, I think this has to be embedded in the whole of our planning system now. The first step we've taken, as I said in my opening remarks, is to set out through the design guide some fairly basic standards, but ones which I think have a great deal of public support. At the beginning of next year, we're going to publish our code, which will be a model code for the whole of the country and set out what may well be quite prescriptive standards. But then we're going to ask every local authority to produce their own version of that code, which will be different in different parts of the country. The Cotswolds will take different views to Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester will take a different view to Nottinghamshire. But we're going to make sure that every local authority does that, does it rigorously, if necessary, has support and guidance and mentoring to get that right. And then we will be trying to follow that process through and ensure that when new developments come forward, they actually adhere to that code, and that design is then placed at the absolute heart of decisions that are being made. And I think there will be a number of things we'll have to do there. We'll have to provide some support to local planning departments to ensure that they really have the capacity and the training to do that. I think councillors themselves will need to think carefully about design. Some take design much more seriously than others, and there may be more we can do with that. And as Secretary of State, when I make decisions on planning applications that come before my department, we will also have to consider whether there are decisions that need to be made to demonstrate that design now matters in this country, and that developers who are bringing forward poor quality designs are going to have to change their practices. So it will be a completely systemic change that will take a long time to embed, but we're going to try to take forward at every level.
Just trying to get a flavour of how many. Lady there. Name and organisation, please.
Thanks. Elizabeth Hopkirk from Building Design magazine. This all sounds great, but you're at the same time you're relaxing, extending permitted development rights, which allows developers to completely bypass all of these codes. How do you reconcile that with wanting to build quality?
Well, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, the reform of the planning system and ensuring good quality design may seem at times contradictory, but we have to try to marry these two forces if we're going to both build hundreds of thousands of new properties that solve the housing crisis in this country and build ones which are high quality and built to last. And that's the task of my department. And we have to set off these two forces like particles in the Hadron Collider and hope that when they meet we can create something that works. With permitted development, it has been a great force in bringing new properties onto the housing market. The original PD of commercial to residential, I think, has brought forward 40 or 50,000 new properties that wouldn't otherwise have been there. Some have been poor quality, and that's what we're currently reviewing, as you may know, as a department, to see if we can learn lessons from that and ensure that the minority doesn't damage the freedom for people to use those rights more broadly across the country. The new permitted development that I've created, which is demolition to rebuild, is a permitted development in principle. And I think this is perhaps the way forwards, where we're giving people the freedom and the certainty to know that they can purchase a property and demolish it, such as a derelict 1960s office building, which is neglected and needs a new future. But they will then still have to work with the local authority to determine what is the height, what is the facade, what is the environmental standards, what might be the space standards within the homes that are going to be built, so that you have certainty and freedom for developers married with quality of design and environmental standards. And that, I think, is the approach that I will be taking as Secretary of State.
Questions? Other questions? Gentleman there in the front, third row from the front. Name and organisation, please.
Stuart Lipton Rogers. I support everything you said, Secretary of State. However, you're looking at 80 years of change since the 1947 Planning Act. More than probably 1,400 pieces of edict from Whitehall. You've got officials who know what they're about. But this is a revolution. You've described Create Streets, wonderful work. What happens to grandmas who'd like to live in a 6-story block in one of those streets? They don't fit in the drawing I see in front, although Nicholas would probably tell me otherwise. What happens to the village greens? What happens to the village greens that we need for social diversification? How do we help the poor? How do we stop house builders getting into the private jet business? This is a revolution. And from what I've read of what you've said recently, I have every confidence. But it's going to require radical change. It's failed. Design codes, for instance, forgive me, CABE, which I chaired 20 years ago, almost to this month, had all this. It was abandoned by Mr. Hunt 10 years ago, didn't have enough money. Not the annual Housing Secretary of State. Because seriously, the real point is beyond just housing. It's our social life, it's the quality of our life, it's the technology, it's the misnomers. The RIBA is a dismal organisation, I say it as an honorary member. So we're going to look to you for real change, and what we want to know is how can we support you in that change?
Very good. Well, I mean, this is an issue that I've cared about my whole life. So when I was appointed the Housing Secretary 3 months ago, it was, for me, the best job that I could possibly have done in government. So you have my complete commitment to this task. It will be up to the Prime Minister and the electorate whether I'm still in this job in a few months' time, but as a week's time, thank you for that vote of confidence.
A week is a long time in politics.
Yeah, I haven't followed what's happening whilst we've been in this room. No, I don't underestimate the challenge of what we're trying to do here. A few things are in our favour. I think, firstly, as I said at the start, there does feel as if we're on the winning side in this argument, that a tide that's needed to turn for a long time is starting to do so. And you see that both in conversations you have at a local level and in moments like the RIBA Sterling Prize, where there's a sense that people are starting to coalesce around a common view that something needs to change and we need to have a more humane architectural vision for the country. I think also politics is changing, and that place has never felt more important in politics. As the referendum taught us, place is the most, if there is a general election, where you live may well be the most important determiner of how you vote, in a way that it hasn't been in my lifetime. It certainly was the case in the general election. If you lived in in the Brexit referendum, if you lived in small towns, you were far more likely to vote to leave than if you lived in big metropolitan cities and university towns. So people, I think, are increasingly focused on place and identity and community, and that's on a cross-party basis. And I think also people are starting to come to the realization that despite the fact our lives are increasingly focused on technology and we're living them on screens on our iPhones, actually people do still care about buildings and objects. I saw this in my former life when I worked in the art world, where despite all of the interest in the digital, people were going to museums more than ever before. They were buying works of art more than any previous generation. And I think my generation is particularly interested in buildings and places and communities in a way that perhaps a previous generation wasn't. And so I do think there's a real will now to take action. But as you say, it's a generational struggle which everybody needs to be part of.
Can I just ask you, just on moment of chairman's privilege, we had an event here a few months ago here at Policy Exchange on socialism and beauty, and looking at various alternative traditions on the left that take away from the sort of stereotyping of the post-war municipal socialist tower block and different tradition of William Morris, the interest of people like Lisa Nandy, placemaking, the demolition of the post office in Wigan was something she talked about, John MacDonald's interest in William Morris. I'm just wondering, in this era of polarisation, generally in politics, whether in the area of placemaking, what the chances, to use our moniker here, of Politics Exchange, of forging a new national consensus. Just be interested in your thoughts on that as a newly minted Secretary of State.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. It does seem as if this is an issue that is of interest across the political divide. There are differences of opinion, though, within that. And certainly the standpoint that I come from is one of trusting local people, of ensuring we might be creating a model code for the whole of the UK, but that is a model which we're then going to be asking each part of the country to come up with their own version of that works for their own local communities. And I don't think a national planning policy has to be the answer here. Actually, some of the best buildings and communities in this country were created long before we had a planning system at all. The places that people most enjoy tend to be those that are the product of a high degree of freedom, community involvement, and individuals taking responsibility for the homes that are being created.
Thank you. Just seeing others getting a flavour of the room. Trying to see. There's a lady there at the front. Name and organisation, please.
Diana Berry, a trustee, Policy Exchange, but previously Art World. My question's about heritage. I love the idea that you're going to have a sort of people's heritage. I'm currently battling with a building in the East End, an 18th century building surrounded by tower blocks, and we are blocked to the left and right by heritage restrictions inside and out. We can't even do that thing called facadism to begin to get anywhere near the sort of eco levels that you're talking about. I'm only a little bit nervous. I love the idea of people's heritage, but do you think they're going to work with English heritage and then actually create more restrictions for moving forward? That does, and how will you deal with the teeth of the existing restrictions, heritage restrictions? In your, I think your scheme is fantastic, and love it when somebody mentions Kenneth Clark's Civilization, as opposed to the noble father of the Lords, but of the House. But no, I just wonder. I worry about more heritage restriction, and the way there are ways of getting around it, and they're not particularly attractive ways. I'd be interested in that.
No, I take that as a legitimate critique, but I rather like everything that we're trying to do here. It's how can you build support for new development by respecting heritage, by respecting quality and design, as a way of making people more supportive of new developments. I don't think the two have to be in impossible opposition if you can strike the right balance. And what we want to do is potentially create or come forward with some new properties that will go on the national statutory listing, but particularly focus on the local listing, which is still significant within the planning policy framework and enables a degree of protection for buildings, everyday buildings that people actually care about. And that's going to be the focus of our efforts, ensuring that there is a good comprehensive listing of that across the country. And it feels to me as if we slightly lost sight of this after my distant predecessor, Michael Heseltine, did this piece of work in the 1980s. And from then onwards, we adopted a perfectly reasonable approach of this being primarily led by experts in Whitehall who came up with thematic lists of which buildings should matter to the country, which obviously is stereotyped as ugly tower blocks in 1960s car parks and so on, but that's not the full story. What we're saying here is quite the opposite, actually. Let's set local people free to determine what matters to them. And they may be quite everyday buildings that are ordinary, but which matter in a particular community. So I'm going to be writing to every parish council in England, explaining our scheme, encouraging them to come forward with proposals and giving them the resources to get these onto the local listings as quickly as possible. And I hope that won't be a significant barrier to the planning system. But I hope that future generations will thank us, because thousands of everyday historic buildings may well be preserved that otherwise would have washed away with development.
I think because time is limited, just take remaining questions in threes. I see there are quite a lot of people. I think there's a gentleman over there who was looking to catch my eye. You weren't looking. Sorry, forgive me. Yes, towards all on one side, please. One after another. Yeah, there, and then move the microphone back. Name and organisation, please.
Secretary of State, thank you.
Organisation, please.
Sorry, Dominic Grace from Savills. You ended your sort of formal part with, and you sort of summed it up, say, with the future of the planning system. And I suspect many of us would have thought, aha, because a lot of people would observe that one of the biggest problems with getting more houses built, and you obviously addressed that at the beginning, the importance of that, is the planning system. And Stuart made the point about the number of rules and regs. Well, they just keep being piled one on top of the other with each new government that comes in. And Stuart used that word of revolution. A lot of people would say we need that wholesale revolution to cover the entire planning process. Could you give us some comfort that you will be looking to do that in order that the sort of dial is moved on housing delivery?
Would you want to just take the time is limited?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Just behind you. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much. Paul Miner from CPRE, the Countryside Charity. Strongly welcome your initiative on local listing. Sounds really exciting, and we're certainly keen to support that any way we can. But one thing I would ask you to consider as you develop that initiative is that there does seem to be worrying evidence of a significant north-south divide, by which in the north I mean Midlands and the north, as opposed to the east and the south, in terms of the state of the historic environment. So there are significantly higher proportions of heritage buildings at risk in the north, and also significantly fewer conservation officers and local authorities in the north. Can you please consider that as you develop this initiative? Thank you.
Yes.
And because time is short, just one final. The lady there towards the back. And the last question, I'm sorry to disappoint anyone.
Louisa Clarence-Smith from The Times. Are you looking at changing the Help to Buy scheme from 2021 to stipulate better quality homes?
Well, very good. Let me take those in reverse order. Help to Buy. I mean, perhaps you're asking me a question there, which is more for the Chancellor in the forthcoming budget. But we have made a number of changes to Help to Buy to ensure that some of its issues have been ameliorated. But there may be more that we can do there. I mean, I'm interested in using all the levers that are at my disposal to push this agenda forwards. And obviously, Help to Buy is one of the more powerful weapons in our arsenal. So I will give that careful consideration. On to the question from our friend from CPRE, absolutely, I'm very conscious of the north-south divide in terms of heritage buildings. Viability, unfortunately, means that there are thousands of historic buildings in the Midlands and the North where it would cost more to renovate them than they're worth today, and that poses a real challenge. That was one of the reasons why we chose to do the Heritage Action Zones with Historic England, which are in cities like Stoke-on-Trent, for example, which has many historic buildings which are sadly in disrepair, and that will provide the beginnings of some extra funding to help restore them. I'm interested in what more we can do to reverse the decline in conservation officers, and there may be more we can do there, particularly pooling resources in larger areas across counties, or even further to reverse that trend, which is worrying. And then the final question, which was, sorry, remind me what the first question was. Planning, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, yes, important. Well, we are going to be bringing forward a white paper on planning reforms. We'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks to be able to say when we'll be publishing that. But I share your analysis that the planning system is essentially broken. We've inherited an exceptionally complex and convoluted planning system, which is the product of the last 75 years of our national life, and that does need radical reform. So we're looking at a number of different changes we can make, and I would like that document to be a very significant step forward to make the planning system work for three different lenses, really: for consumers who interact with the planning system, for small builders, of which we need far more, and then for larger developers who, of course, play such a critical role in getting communities built, particularly major changes like new towns and villages that we want to be built, but built in the right way. So I hope that document will be one that's perceived when it is published to be a real step forward for the planning system, and I'm very interested in anybody's views and ideas in the coming weeks as we finalise that document.
As Stalin used to say, in the matter of arms production, eventually enough quantity becomes quality. And this audience has been both quantity and quality. And to throw, but also to throw this together with great pleasure. We like living spontaneously, dangerously at short notice. The turnout here today, tribute to yourself, tribute to the importance of the themes. Just all that remains for me, we're delighted to partner up with Create Streets on this, to call upon Nicholas Boyd-Smith, wearing both his Create Streets hats on this occasion, but delighted to welcome also, and congratulations to him on his appointment as co-chair of the Building Beautiful Commission. Nicholas, looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Many hats, like Humphrey. Thank you, Secretary of State. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard actually a very important speech. When I went mad and set up Create Streets 6 years ago, do you remember the old Bob Monkhouse line? So I told them I wanted to be. When I told them I wanted to be a comedian, they all laughed. They're not laughing now. Well, I feel a little bit. I mean, he's dead, of course, Bob Monkhouse. I feel a little bit like this. To quote Stuart Lipton, this is potentially a revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, 60, 70 years ago, this country, and I've said many other countries, made a mistake of historic proportions. We looked at the freedom that the newly minted motor car created in the rural roads in the 1930s, and we assumed that that freedom needed to be brought through to our towns and cities. We took the capacity that we had created through technology to throw up great big box sheds at an immensely minute cost, and assumed that that therefore must be the answer, even though we were squeezing the humanity out of where we live and work. And now is the time to reverse those errors, and I believe we're going to do it. When I heard that you had been appointed, I whooped for joy, and I can say this, you've already had a more positive impact. Even if you achieve nothing, you won't like this bit of sentence, we'll that second bit. Even if you achieve nothing, you've already had a more positive impact on the built environment than many housing ministers, let's put it that way. Some of you may not know, ladies and gentlemen, but Robert Jenrick was crucial to getting the funding to save Wentworth Woodhouse. I hope you've all been there. We've talked about the north-south here. It is one of the 2 or 3 most important buildings in Britain. It is the largest private house in Britain. It's got the longest frontage, and it's falling down. It was nearly mined to death in the 1950s. I think Save called you one of the most positive politicians for the built environment. It's got 25, I think, kilometres of corridors. So we're up on the deal, whatever happens next, okay? So bank that. 40% of our personal health outcomes are a function of where we live rather than who we are. And where we live is a complex, multi-layered thing. You, I believe, sir, you grew up in Ludlow. W.G. Hoskins, one of the great historians, again, you should all read if you haven't, I'm sure you have, said that most of England is 1,000 years old. And in a walk of a few miles, one would touch nearly every century in that long stretch of time. The cultural humus of 60 generations or more lies upon it. Well, Ludlow is an Anglo-Saxon name. It means the place on a hill by the loud waters, Ludlow. Your constituency is obviously Newark, with the Sherwood Forest inside, which has villages with the names like Blidworth, Clipstone, Egmanton, Farmandrum, Gunthorpe, Hallam, Houghton. The essence of England rolls through these names. But you're also a clearly modern man. You've got a Jewish wife. You've made enormously important steps for social inclusion and for combating anti-Semitism. Yes, I only got my antis the wrong way around there. Gladstone was the former MP for your constituency. His great rival Disraeli, as you will know this quote, we've talked about the North and the South, he talked of, in his brilliant novel Coningsby, 2 nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's thoughts and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones, very planning term there. And I think we face that challenge now. There are bits of England and Britain that are flourishing, and some of them very close to here, that are not. And how we think about the quality of place. We know what people want to live and where they want to live. The data is becoming increasingly clear. And we're not providing it most of the time. A recent study, not yet published, shows that 2/3 of what we're building is poor or mediocre. One of the first schemes we looked at within Create Streets, I asked, I was doing some work for the ministry, and I asked the chair of the Tenants Association, it was actually well conceived in many ways, a state regeneration, what are your favourite bits of London? Where do you most want to live? And it was as if I'd sort of pulled out an emotional pop. The streets we used to live in the very same place we're talking at, where I grew up, gosh, they were lovely. You could walk down the street and speak to your cousins. You could talk over the garden fence. These basic human, neighbourly, a word you use very rightly. And the poor architect, who was a good man, he was well-intentioned, he looked at me almost with horror, you can't do that. And he's right, he couldn't have done that. He could not have put back those terraced houses. Well, we have got to change that. Someone said to me the other day that the wheelie bin operators are the most important designers of our streets. That may not be right, ladies and gentlemen. And the very important question from Elizabeth Hopkirk from Building Design magazine, that there is a way, I think, to square some of these necessary tensions, and I'll just suggest two of them. And we have always regulated our built environment. The Romans did it, the Anglo-Saxons did it. The first extant bit of London property regulation is from 1187, when we banned thatch, for very good reasons. Thatch is quite dangerous in a medieval city. I've never been in a medieval city, but I believe it to be dangerous. The point is, the best regulation is clear and certain, and doesn't create an unlevel playing field where the people with the deepest pockets are best able to play the system. There's no criticism of that. We need to create a level playing field, and we need to bring the democracy forward so that people's righteous and legitimate need to influence, and most people don't feel they influence where they live, only 25% of people feel they influence where they live, but that need is brought early into the democratic decision-making process, not turned into a fight, a bun fight at the end. Stuart, you asked how can we support this revolution. I think first of all is to help the ministry and local councils and neighbourhood forums and parishes to bring the democracy forward and set a level playing field, to come up with ideas. If you're a developer, to do this. If you're a resident, to get involved with your neighbourhood plan. The other great answer, of course, is to support Policy Exchange or to support Create Streets, I may say. There's little links here. You can give money to our charity, or you can engage with us to help make better places. And I'd just like to finish by saying have a very good day, and thank you very much, Secretary of State, for a very important speech. Thank you.